The announcement came at 9:02 a.m., company-wide email, subject line, new leadership for the strategy vertical. I opened it slowly, though I already knew what was inside. 4 paragraphs, a few bullet points, and one name, highlighted in bold, followed by a photo I had seen rehearsed a dozen times. Kelsey Quinn, appointed Director of Strategic Integration. Beneath her name was a quote from the new boss. Kelsey embodies the energy and visibility we need as we expand cross-functional impact. I read that sentence twice. Energy and visibility, not performance, not results, not logic. I didn't get up, didn't walk out, didn't send a single message. I just closed the email and turned off my notifications. And that was the moment I knew. The system had made its choice. My name is Iris Caldwell. I've been with Farron & Blake for 7 years. I joined when we were still working out of a subleased suite, 3 blocks from where our headquarters now scrape the skyline. Back then, there was no strategy division, no slides, no lanyards, just problems, and me solving them. I wasn't the loudest, never wanted to be. I was the one people called when they didn't want to explain things twice. When the client needed precision, not flair. When revenue was threatened and politics couldn't help. And I delivered, quarter after quarter. Contract after contract, I rebuilt our implementation framework. Designed the logic that kept our turnaround times the lowest in our segment. But what I didn't do was brand it. I didn't watermark the work with my name. Didn't walk into meetings and rehearse wins out loud. Because I believed in what held, not what sparkled. Then the new boss arrived, polished, charismatic, said things like optics drive influence, and you don't lead by being correct. You lead by being remembered. In his first town hall, he wore a blazer with no tie and said, "You can't scale substance without style." People laughed. I stayed quiet. Kelsey laughed too. She always did. Kelsey joined 2 years ago, came from a bigger brand, had a background in product marketing, not systems, but she had what the new boss liked: fluency and corporate tone. A way of moving through a room like she was narrating a case study in real time. She quoted leadership books, kept eye contact just long enough, asked vague questions with emphasis on verbs. And her numbers? Safe, never disastrous, never impressive, but always dressed in performance decks with gradient backgrounds and headlines like reframing the funnel. 3 months before the announcement, we both applied for the role. She presented a deck, I presented a system. She talked about expanding influence, I talked about reducing cost of delay. She smiled. I stayed neutral, he chose her. Not because she was better, but because she shimmered more. And in his world, shimmer meant potential. What he didn't realize was that everything holding his vertical upright was built by someone who never needed shimmer to be remembered. I didn't congratulate her, not out of pride, out of precision. Because I understood exactly what the promotion meant, not for her, for the system. It meant they no longer valued coherence. They valued performance. Not in metrics, but in presence, in posture. And presence without grounding is just theater. I watched Kelsey take the seat I had designed the structure for, literally. The seat in the West Side conference room, closest to the screen, with the cleanest sightline, was one I had picked out when we redesigned the war room for cross-functional syncs. I had chosen the lighting based on how the glare hit printed materials, adjusted the ventilation so the projector wouldn't fog charts near the window. Now she sat in it like it had always been hers. Like none of it had been calibrated. Like systems just exist. She opened her first leadership sync with a statement. Let's redefine what success feels like. Not what it delivers, what it feels like. I sat in the corner, 4 seats back, took notes, didn't interrupt, because I wanted to see how long it would take for feelings to run into the walls of reality. That same week, she launched a new initiative. Velocity Sprint, 90 Days to Strategic Lift. The name was pure branding. The strategy was pure speculation. She pushed for more client-facing frameworks, even when delivery capacity was already overstretched. She insisted on executive polish for internal decks. She removed 2 core checkpoints from rollout workflows to accelerate onboarding. The new boss applauded her decisiveness, said her energy was contagious. I didn't argue. I let it spread. Until the first delay hit. A Tier 1 client flagged a delivery slip. Something small but time-sensitive. Kelsey said, "We'll adjust timelines and circle back." But she didn't know that timeline had been mapped across 4 dependencies, 2 vendors, and a compensation clause buried in a Q2 amendment. I did, because I had written it, by hand, on a whiteboard. 2 years ago, She hadn't even read the clause. I was asked, quietly, off-thread, if I could help untangle the escalation. I said, "You may want to ask the director. It falls within her scope now." And it did. I wasn't being cruel. I was being precise. Because systems don't fail from sabotage. They fail from being handled by people who don't understand where the weight lives. And I had carried that weight for so long, so invisibly, that no one remembered I was the counterbalance. They only noticed now that things had begun to sway. The new boss called me in for a check-in. His tone was light, friendly. "Iris, I know the outcome probably wasn't what you hoped for, but I want you to know how much we value your steadiness." Steadiness, as if I were an air conditioning unit, reliable, quiet, not leadership, just climate control. I nodded once, didn't thank him. And when he said, "Let me know if you want to be more involved in Velocity Sprint," I simply replied, "Happy to contribute where needed." What I meant was where they thought I was needed, because if they no longer wanted the spine, they could have the skin. Let them stretch it as far as they wanted. I'd be watching what cracked first. The first thing I stopped doing was correcting. Not mistakes, expectations. I stopped fixing forecasts that were built on misunderstood dependencies. Stopped rephrasing emails to clients that overpromised capacity. Stopped offering historical nuance in meetings when someone misquoted how a system came to be. I let the misunderstandings stand, because what they had chosen, what they had promoted, was presence. Let presence carry itself. The silence wasn't malicious, it was methodical. For 7 years, I had been the invisible tension wire across 3 departments. I bridged product with delivery. I translated client anxieties into internal safeguards. I mapped what wasn't said into what could quietly fail. And then I watched someone get promoted for never noticing what wasn't said at all. So I subtracted myself from the glue. When asked to review a new template Kelsey's team had built for pre-sale scope, I didn't decline. I said, "Happy to take a look after client feedback starts coming in." It wasn't passive-aggressive, it was accurate. Because why test assumptions with experience when presence is what's rewarded? Kelsey didn't notice. Her team released the template with 5 logic gaps. It worked until a client noticed misalignment between what was scoped and what had been committed last year. That's when people looked around the room, not for Kelsey, for someone who remembered why that commitment was made in the first place. But no one asked me. Not yet. I stayed in my lane, fulfilled my scope. I answered questions precisely, but only the ones asked. I no longer filled in the blanks, and the blanks got louder. Soon syncs started running longer. Quick updates became full-blown debates. Decisions got delayed because no one could confirm what had already been done. People started reopening closed tickets, not because of bugs, but because of memory loss. The new boss didn't notice either. He was busy praising proactive communication and posting thought leadership threads about visibility over velocity. The irony was almost cinematic. Because nothing was moving, I stopped attending optional roundtables, stopped prepping side decks, stopped flagging the little things early. I wasn't sabotaging, I was demonstrating. What happens when you remove the uncredited layer of sense-making? What happens when you cut the thread that doesn't raise its voice, but holds the weave together? And the weave had started to warp. People didn't complain, they hesitated. Hesitation is louder than protest when you know what to listen for. In one team meeting, Kelsey showed a flowchart that was meant to replace our old risk matrix. It looked sleek, color-coded, linear, except it skipped 2 decision gates I had created to prevent exactly what had stalled 3 launches last year. No one questioned it, but no one used it either. Because even people who chase presence can feel the difference between what looks structured and what actually holds. I began documenting, not to prove anything, but to ensure no one could pretend nothing had happened. Not documents for the system, documents for the silence. A folder named Structure Notes, Internal Eyes Only. Nested within it, subfolders, Forecast Fragility, since Sprint Rollout Client Exceptions, removed from Scope's dependency. Shifts without redundancy risks, deferred for optics. Each one contained things that didn't have error codes. Just warnings no one logged. I didn't share it, didn't leak it, didn't encrypt it. Because the collapse I was preparing for didn't need sabotage. It just needed witnesses. And I intended to leave the record behind, quietly, legibly, without defense. Every time a new optimization was rolled out without testing, I wrote a note. Every time a client asked for something they used to get and was told it wasn't in scope, I saved the original scope. Time-stamped, labeled, not to win, but because if they ever came to me again and said, "We didn't realize," I wanted to be able to answer, "You were shown. You just preferred not to see." Meanwhile, I stopped shielding Kelsey's decisions. When people routed questions to me that now fell under her ownership, I redirected. "You'll want to run that through the strategy lead." Some hesitated, some rolled their eyes. One person said, "You know she's just going to ask you anyway." I replied, "Then she should know what to ask." And that was the point. You can't borrow presents when you don't understand weight. At one point, Kelsey approached me in the hallway, bright and beaming. "Hey, can we grab some time? I'd love your thoughts on how to evolve the delivery logic across client types." I paused, not out of contempt, out of clarity. "Sure, let me know what you want to preserve." She blinked. "What do you mean?" "You're evolving something. That usually means keeping the right things and cutting the wrong ones, but I haven't heard anyone define what's worth preserving." She smiled diplomatically. "Well, that's what I'd love your help thinking through." I nodded, but didn't schedule the meeting, because if you're leading something and still asking others to tell you what matters, you're not leading, you're decorating. That same week, 2 projects missed their internal checkpoints. Both had been on autopilot since I stepped back. Both failed for the same reason. No one remembered what triggered the escalation sequence. Because escalation wasn't a button, it was a judgment, mine. But no one had asked for it anymore. So I let it lapse and watched the silence thicken. The new boss didn't intervene. He was hosting a culture resilience offsite that week. When he returned, he sent a company-wide update with the phrase, "Our culture is only as strong as the energy we bring into the room." I read it twice. Then I clicked archive, because the room didn't need more energy. It needed someone who remembered why the walls didn't fall in, and I was no longer that person. Not because I stopped caring, but because they'd made it clear. They wanted something louder than stability. Now they had it. The first error wasn't visible. It was a line item, slightly misaligned. A contract renewal scheduled 2 weeks too early. No one noticed it until the invoice bounced. By then, the client had already escalated, not through account management, through legal. The clause in question, a billing cadence exception I'd implemented 4 years ago, because their fiscal year started in February. Everyone knew that, until they didn't. The new boss didn't understand the pushback. He asked if it was just a delay in payment systems. Said it must be operational lag. But it wasn't lag, it was absence. The kind that spreads when memory is replaced by optimism. Kelsey responded by proposing a new client tiering framework. Said it would align our attention with long-term revenue opportunities. It was a glossy PDF with colored rows and motivational quotes. It didn't fix the problem, because the problem wasn't prioritization, it was continuity. The client didn't want more attention. They wanted not to be forgotten. The second failure came from inside. A senior associate built a light version of our implementation workflow based on Kelsey's suggestion. The aim was to reduce friction, move faster, and remove low-value steps. 3 internal teams flagged concerns. None were addressed. The workflow launched. 2 clients immediately reported delivery inconsistencies. One sent back a list of tasks they had expected, ones that had been removed from the new workflow. Their message ended with a line I hadn't seen in a while. "We were told this was standard. Has that changed?" I wasn't copied, but someone forwarded it to me with no message. Just the subject line, "Is this ours?" I replied, "It was, but this isn't what we built." I didn't say more, because what was unraveling didn't need my commentary, it needed weight, and that weight had been replaced with branding. The new boss doubled down, scheduled a town hall, talked about adaptive cycles, celebrating flexibility, and outgrowing legacy friction. Kelsey presented a new initiative, client energy matching, meet them where they think we are. People clapped, out of habit, not out of belief, because belief had started to thin. One of the implementation leads whispered to me after the meeting, "I miss when we knew why we were doing things." I nodded, said nothing, but I felt it too. The silence in rooms that used to hum. The Slack messages typed, then deleted. The documents opened, then closed. The shift from confidence to caution was everywhere. Not loud, but exact. People stopped improvising, started checking twice, and slowly the question began to rise, not in words, but in eyes. Who still knows how this works? And that was the beginning of unraveling. Not when things fail, but when people stop trusting the room to catch them if they do. By the time the second client walked away, No one used the word attrition anymore. They called it realignment. Said the client wasn't a cultural fit. Said we needed to focus on relationships that scale. But I knew. That client had been ours since year 2. They'd stayed through pricing changes, onboarding delays, a full rebrand. The only thing they couldn't stay through was forgetting. The forgetting wasn't personal, it was procedural. The new rollout template they'd been given lacked a compliance override, one that I had manually inserted every single quarter without being asked. Because they worked across 2 jurisdictions, because standard never worked for them. But Kelsey's team had streamlined everything, called it template unification. And what they unified, they erased. After the cancellation, the delivery team asked me, privately, if I still had the old compliance flag. I did. I sent it, no comments, just the file. They never replied, but a day later, I noticed Kelsey's calendar held a private sync with legal, followed by a 1-1 with finance, followed by an all hands for the strategy experience team. I didn't attend. I wasn't invited. But I heard the feedback loop begin. First, the murmurs. Why are we changing things that were working? Wasn't this flagged in last year's audit? Did anyone validate this with the original model? Then came the cross-checks. People pulling up archived versions of workflows, finding discrepancies, looking for names. Mine came up. Not loudly, but often. The boss tried to reset momentum. He scheduled a vision day, a full afternoon of slides, breakout rooms, and facilitated discussion. He said, culture drives clarity. But no one was confused about the culture anymore. They were confused about the work. What was still real? What had been overwritten? What was preserved quietly by the people no longer centered? Kelsey held the mic like she'd practiced in front of a mirror. Said we needed confidence in change and consistency in tone. I watched from the back of the room and saw something she didn't. The people who used to nod weren't nodding. The ones who used to add flair were holding pens, not speaking. And the ones who used to defer to presence were now glancing sideways, looking for structure. Not a person, a pattern, and I had been that pattern for 7 years. Now, with that pattern removed, they were beginning to feel what I had always absorbed for them, the tremor beneath the calm, the part of the system that looks fine until it's asked to hold something heavy. And they were holding something heavy now. Deadlines, discrepancies, doubt, the weight that presence was never designed to carry. The first signal wasn't public. It came through a Slack message, sent to me by accident. A junior delivery analyst had posted a question in the wrong thread. Do we have any documentation on how Iris handled client onboarding logic before Sprint Lite? Nothing in the shared drive matches what's failing. I didn't respond, not because I was offended, because I didn't have to. Someone else replied 5 minutes later, Iris isn't on that anymore. Check with strategy. No one replied to that because strategy didn't know, because Kelsey didn't know, because presence doesn't archive process. That same week, 2 high-value clients flagged billing discrepancies. Both claimed they were invoiced for modules that had been scoped out during final contract edits. Those edits had happened in person, in a room, with me and one of their legal advisors. We had agreed to remove language from a fallback clause, something that hadn't been updated in the template system. I had updated it manually on the spot. The new templates, Kelsey's templates, had reverted to defaults. The client sent back one sentence. Was this intentional? And that question, soft as it sounded, triggered a 5-day scramble. Product blamed outdated logic, legal blamed documentation gaps, strategy blamed template misalignment. What no one blamed was presence. Because presence doesn't process billing. It doesn't cross-reference contract memory. It doesn't catch the small clauses that undo trust. It just smiles and gestures and hopes people don't notice the tremor behind the polish. But the tremor had turned into weight. The implementation team missed a 3rd straight delivery window. The client paused rollout. Revenue recognition was held. Finance sent an email asking for urgent attribution clarity. That phrase, attribution clarity, is what you hear before the board starts reviewing compensation. Kelsey called an all hands. I attended, sat near the door, took notes, didn't speak. She walked to the front with the same confidence, same tonal rise, same designer blouse, and said, "We're at a crossroads, and that's a good thing." No one smiled. She used phrases like reset expectations, lean into velocity, and lead from center. But no one needed energy. They needed instructions. The new boss wasn't there. The rumor was that he was meeting with the investors, not to report progress, to explain what had gone missing, and what had gone missing was context. Every template that no longer made sense, every client request that hit a wall, every forecast built on enthusiasm instead of infrastructure. I didn't need to say anything, because when a system is truly collapsing, you don't have to push, you just have to stop holding. And I had stopped holding a long time ago. The silence hit harder than any accusation, not because it was loud, but because no one tried to fill it anymore. After the third major client delayed their renewal, finance stopped asking when the deals would close. They started asking if. Operations pulled back headcount forecasts. Product paused the Q4 roadmap. Legal submitted a note asking for contractual language consistency across legacy tiers. That last one said everything. Because legacy wasn't the issue, it was the glue. And the glue had been replaced by gradients and slogans. Kelsey kept showing up, still smiling, still quoting frameworks, still closing meetings with "let's move forward and trust." But no one trusted her anymore, not out of spite, out of exposure. They had seen what she couldn't see. A person leading with posture, without architecture. In one meeting, a partner lead asked her, gently, "Do we know who actually built the approval logic in the vendor review queue? There's something broken at step 6. She hesitated, said she'd circle with ops. No one looked at me, but 3 people wrote something down. That afternoon, I received a Slack message from someone I barely knew. "I'm sorry, I thought you were just being quiet. I didn't realize you were letting us hear the noise." I didn't respond, because by then, the noise had grown into feedback, and feedback had become consensus. One more delivery failure, one more performance review canceled, one more client asking for the original scoping team. Each one another step toward the place no one wanted to admit we were standing. Collapse. Not dramatic, not sudden, just the slow turning of attention. Away from charisma, back to competence. The new boss returned for one final meeting. He said it was just a reset. He said the vision hadn't changed. He said, "This is what transitions feel like." But no one replied. Not because we agreed, because we were already writing new systems, on top of the fragments. And the new boss, he disappeared the same way he arrived. Confident, decorated, misunderstanding the weight of everything he never learned to carry. Kelsey wasn't removed, not publicly, not officially, but her team was folded. Her title dissolved into a cross-functional mentorship track, and the space she had occupied at the front of the room now sat empty. No one rushed to fill it. They were too busy picking up pieces she hadn't noticed she'd dropped. I watched quietly, didn't intervene, didn't say "I told you so," because I didn't. I only ever said what was true, and then watched what happened when they decided it wasn't bright enough to lead with. They didn't offer me a new title, no promotion, no apology, no quiet handshake in a glass room. The shift didn't begin in leadership. It began in the questions, subtle at first, uncertain. "Hey, do you remember why the segmentation logic used to trigger earlier in Q2 rollout? We're seeing a drop in onboarding stability. Did the old framework account for client size differently? When we used to scope cross-regional accounts, did you have a model for that, or was it more ad hoc?" They came from people I hadn't spoken to in months. People who had once reposted Kelsey's strategy quotes on Slack. People who had smiled at the new boss when he said, "Style builds trust faster than data." Now they were sitting in late meetings, watching deadlines slip without explanation. Now they were getting questions from clients they couldn't answer. Now they were looking not for solutions, but memory, and memory had one shape. Mine. I didn't gloat, didn't draw attention to it. I just began to answer, not with decks, not with vision statements, with structure. A line of SQL logic that used to catch exceptions. A hand-built checklist for edge case onboarding. A simple flow diagram from 2019 that mapped where human judgment had to replace automation. One day, that diagram showed up in a meeting again. Someone had found it in a shared folder I'd forgotten I'd left behind. It was printed, annotated, passed around in silence. One person said, "I always thought this was just Iris's style. Now I realize it was scaffolding." Someone else nodded. "No one builds like this anymore." The interim strategy lead, the person brought in after Kelsey's quiet removal, messaged me that afternoon. "You free for a deep structure session?" The word structure stood out. Not sync, not brainstorm, not alignment. Structure. I walked into a conference room where the whiteboard had already been cleared. She stood at the front, no laptop, just a dry erase marker and a single phrase already written. If we had to rebuild it from scratch, what do we keep? I didn't answer immediately, because that wasn't a prompt. It was an admission. They weren't looking for ideas anymore. They were looking for foundation, and not in theory, in practice, in files, in decisions that held when performance metrics cracked. So I showed them what I still had. A folder, not digital, paper. Inside, the original pricing logic from when we expanded regionally. 3 versions of delivery frameworks, each annotated for risk. 2 signed-off exceptions I had recorded manually when legal forgot to update policy after a clause change. None of it was dramatic, but all of it was real. And real was suddenly the most valuable thing in the building. They started copying me again, not because they were told to, because they didn't trust anything that hadn't been seen by me. One afternoon, the new operations lead forwarded a budget scenario and wrote, "Gut check, is this stable or are we wish casting again?" I replied with 2 red lines and a time-stamped file. He updated the model. No pushback, no meeting, because by then they understood. I wasn't trying to win. I had already done that the moment I stopped patching things they refused to see. Now they were seeing them, and one by one, they weren't asking me to fix them. They were asking me to remind them what it looked like before they broke it. I didn't stay to be reinstated, because reinstatement implies restoration of something that was lost. But nothing was lost. I had always been here. What changed wasn't my position. It was their ability to recognize what I'd been holding. Not authority, not power, but weight. And now that they had begun to feel that weight for themselves, now that they'd tried to carry it and found their arms trembling, they were learning how to respect it. The interim team had started reassembling the foundation. Meetings were shorter, language became precise. There were fewer slogans, more silence. I liked that. One afternoon, someone stopped me in the hallway, a senior manager in delivery, someone I barely knew. She said, "I know this sounds strange, but I feel like I've been walking through a version of the company you always saw, and I'm just now catching up to it." I nodded once, didn't offer comfort, didn't make it about me. Because it wasn't. This was never a redemption arc. It was correction, delayed, earned. The COO invited me to an offsite session with the new leadership team. I declined, not because I wasn't ready to contribute, but because I didn't want to build the next version of the machine. That wasn't mine to hold anymore. What I wanted was simpler. To leave knowing that this time, when they rewrote the structure, they'd remember to draw on the parts that never made it to the surface. And they did. That same week, the strategy group published a new internal document. Not a roadmap, not a vision, a record, titled, "What We Forgot and What We Now Remember." I wasn't named, but I didn't need to be, because I recognized every diagram, every clause, every decision flow. They had taken what I'd buried in silence and surfaced it in structure. On my last day, I packed slowly. No one stopped me, no one protested. They just knew this wasn't a departure. It was a completion. At 5:42 p.m., I sent one message, a single line, company-wide. If you ever feel like the system isn't holding, ask what it forgot and who once remembered it. I logged out, walked past the room that used to host the velocity meetings. Now it was quiet. No music, just a whiteboard with one phrase in blue marker, designed for what lasts when presence leaves. No signature, but I didn't need one. Because legacy doesn't live in names. It lives in what others choose to rebuild using your silence as blueprint. I stepped into the elevator. No regrets, no weight left in my hands, because what I carried was never mine to keep. Only mine to hold until they finally learned how not to drop it.